Welcome back. For those of you that are just joining us now, I'm Stephen Sullivan, co-founder of House of Complexity. I hope for those that have been on the journey today, you've had a moment to breathe. It's certainly been a lot of information, but very enriching. We're going to continue on that track now with the final sessions for the afternoon, and in some respect it's been a lovely bridge from the last couple where we've been exploring how we work across different fields and contexts and how meaning and sense making and interrogating assumptions are so essential to the work that we do within complexity. So this session's an interesting one: philosophy, innovation and organisational life, and there's perhaps two different key themes that we're going to be exploring here. In one sense, we've got a couple of people who I'm going to introduce in just a moment whose work explicitly draws on philosophy for their practice, and we're going to examine what is the value of that and how do you go about doing that. In another, though, we're going to move beyond the idea that philosophy is just an academic exercise, and actually it is a highly practical, highly not only critical but also creative practice as well. And in the context of innovation, in the context of reorganising, reordering our social life, our organisational life, it's something I've personally had a lot of great value from. So quite a lot to unpack here in terms of how we go about examining our assumptions, philosophy, actually what is it and what does it do for us, and just more broadly, critical inquiry as a practice. So just on my right here, I've got Dr. Juliet Bennett, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Sydney Centre for Healthy Societies, working across social systems, food, health and critical theory. Her research explores how individual action and structural change can be reconnected through process philosophy and community-led approaches. And a very interesting book that actually connects up around how we can approach peace through a process philosophy perspective, which I'm sure we'll be getting into. Just on her right, we've got Dr. Julian Prester, senior lecturer also at Sydney University at the within the business school. So Julian's work actually intersects at a really interesting space for a lot of people here, which is our organisational practices and particularly around digital work as well, and understanding that, how that emerges through ongoing processes there. So really studying people and technology, which I think couldn't be more relevant. We have, once again, welcome back to Amelia, Olsen-Boyd, who is an executive manager at CSIRO, and as we explored earlier, very interested in innovation, particularly at a systemic level. And we've got a dear friend, Scott Matter, from the UTS Transdisciplinary School. And Scott is such a fascinating background, brings together both anthropology as well as futures thinking as well. Scott's also really draws on political ecology design as well to explore different ways of thinking and acting in complex systems. So, welcome to you all. Maybe just because you're closest with me, Juliet, perhaps you could just share a little bit about what's this book that you've put out in fairly recently, and how does it intersect with philosophy?
Sure. So my book's called Reimagining Peace Through Process Philosophy. And process philosophy is kind of not very well known, even as sort of a field in, I guess, academic philosophy, because it's this lively, interdisciplinary approach to philosophy that's kind of been in the margins. It's not, academic philosophy has kind of been divided by this analytical philosophy approach and the continental approach, which is more historical, and it kind of crosses over both. And my book, I studied peace and conflict studies, and it was based on my PhD in that field. And I was looking at what is a paradigm of peace for peace, and what are the changes that need to happen in order for us to move toward a more peaceful, just, and sustainable society. So just small questions. And what I found is with process philosophy, it gives us a way to think and understand the modes of thought that are involved in moving toward a more peaceful society. it gives us a metaphysics, a way of understanding knowledge, a way of understanding what it is to be in the world. So the ontology, and then it has all of these rich applications in ecological economics. In there's a process theology is one of the big areas that it's had traction. It really brings philosophy into the big questions. What is God? What does it mean to be human? What is the purpose? And then it very much resonates with complex systems thinking, because they have shared intellectual roots, but it gives a way to bring that to life.
And just before we move on, a couple of terms there, ontology and metaphysics. What are we talking here?
Sure. So I guess these are the big questions about the world. So an ontology is what it means to be in the world. And so these questions, the last session was talking about these questions, and these ideas and the philosophers that the last speakers were speaking about are really engaging with what is life, what is our body, what are our relationships like. So metaphysics kind of broadly, it's like there's physics and there's what's more than physics. And so it brings those big questions up. Yeah.
Awesome. Julian, I will throw over to yourself. Do you want to share a little bit about your practice, your research, and how that intersects with some of these themes?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a senior lecturer in the business school at the University of Sydney, and my work is really sort of at the intersection of technology, work, and organizing. So specifically, my PhD was centered on doing research on digital nomads. I actually started my work just before COVID, so that wasn't really that big of a topic at the time yet, working remotely and from home and all that. But there was these people that were working out of co-working spaces in Chiang Mai, in Thailand, in Indonesia. And that was basically my field work at the time. So I was spending a lot of time with them in those places and doing really rich, in-depth ethnographic work with those kinds of people and figuring out how they work and how they organize themselves. And increasingly now, since remote work, working from home is becoming more and more of a topic also in organizations. It's not just individuals doing that anymore. My research sort of also shifts more towards those kinds of fully remote kind of organizations that don't have any sort of physical office, physical space anymore. They are distributed across the world and sort of working in an entirely virtual environment. And I actually came to process philosophy or process theory sort of from the fieldwork itself, not really through like theory seminars or anything like that, not even through books really. At the time I was just sort of in that space, in those co-working spaces, and I realized that the traditional organizational concepts, like how we understand identity, how we understand space, how we understand roles, boundaries, it didn't really fit the way that digital nomads were working. And so that's where I started reading a bit more broadly into different literatures outside of sort of traditional management and organizations theory, and came across process research, process theory, and that sort of made a lot more sense with me in the moment, in those spaces, and that's how I came to process philosophy.
Also, I think we'll spend some time unpacking this process philosophy thing in a moment. But Amelia or Scott, critical inquiry or an engagement with a deeper sense of values and assumptions. Yeah, how does this show up in your worlds?
Okay. I was going to say thank you for not asking how I came to process philosophy, because I came to 2 weeks ago. Look, my work at CSIRO is twofold. It's around building an innovation systems and foresighting practice for the organisation. And it's also about researching the political economy of innovation. My background is a winding path through political science, film. I spent a decade in the film industry, and law. And so I have, I think, a deep understanding of rules and also of narrative and technology, in fact. So those are the things that I see fused in my practice. And, the way that I see some of these things showing up is I really find the metaphor of dark matter to be incredibly powerful. I think there are, and I was just saying to Scott beforehand, I'm irreducibly one of these people who thinks that neoliberalism has been a pretty totalising phenomena in our society, in our institutions, in our narratives, in our governance. And so what I find is, what I encounter is a set of assumptions that are almost unacknowledged, subterranean, about why innovation exists. And part of the work of my colleagues, and I particularly my research colleagues, is to question that narrative and to challenge whether or not, in fact, growth for its own sake is something that is a virtue, whether or not there are ways in which we can think about innovation as being the work that the bus driver does by stopping to wait for the old lady that he knows is going to come along every afternoon and isn't necessarily about jet-fueled rockets all the time. There isn't a piece of technology that gets produced in every innovation. And so I think that finding a way to gently surface the set of assumptions that underlie a lot of thinking and a lot of narratives is the way in which I think about philosophy in my own work.
Yeah. I'm really enjoying this conversation already, and I haven't said a word. So I come to all this stuff through a background in anthropology, and particularly started out in ecological anthropology, so I was probably radicalized into process thinking pretty early, and recognizing that maybe the things we think are things aren't actually things, which is kind of a deep and scary philosophical comment. And I guess hearing you mention neoliberalism, one of the things that's interesting there is, so there's a whole bunch of assumptions baked into that aren't even recognized as assumptions. They're treated as truths, which then gets back to philosophy again, right? Because we have this search for meaning and truth. And if we can recognize that the things we hold as truths are assumptions, then we can actually start to question them. So two of the ways that I do that are through the sort of anthropological ethnographic approach and then a futures approach. And in both of these, what we're trying to do is introduce people to often radical alternative ways of being and ways of organizing our life, or ways of organizing societies, as a way to then reflect on the fact that our way of organizing society isn't the only way. It's maybe not even a good way. And so, yeah, I guess that's where I come into it.
Yeah, do you know, in my work doing innovation, one of the biggest challenges is how do you reveal the things that are just so obvious we just don't even question them?
Yeah.
And if you consider in a very practical context, often there is some brief that says we need to go out and do this thing for various reasons, and this is what we think what a success looks like. And my process always starts with getting a sense of what's the boundaries here, the guardrails, the scope. And it's incredible how much that can always change. And what I'm also always looking for is what level of conviction do I have? I'm always sort of prodding and probing just to get a sense of how open are we to actually exploring and unpacking that. And, you know, why for me this is such an important topic or capacity, this type of inquiry to reveal and examine what we take for granted that we're typically blind to, is one, because of how pervasive it is. And I think I mentioned earlier, it's the idea of the goldfish that doesn't even realize they're in water there. And that for me has been one of the more valuable things, at least in my experience in the philosophy that I've dabbled into, is that it helps you build the capacity that's well, the humility first and foremost. To your point, Scott, some of the ideas that we'll pick up in a moment around processes, even questioning the idea of things in general, it definitely expands your horizons and helps you step into whether it is a brief for innovation with a lot more openness, I suppose, which is, that's my motivation in setting up a talk with an audience that often comes from a sort of industry or practical perspective, because I recognise philosophy typically. You're not making a lot of friends in the office if you're trying to say how great this thing is. And I guess this is, a bit of an opportunity to explore what is the value, given so much of today has been about we need to explore values better. We need to open up more questions. Shall we? I wonder. We've spoken quite a bit about process philosophy, and even questioning things as opposed to processes. Maybe it might be nice, especially because complexity, I would say, is a very good bedfellow with process philosophy, and a lot of the underlying commitments, if you will, are very much tied together. So maybe we can, unpack that a little bit. What is process philosophy? What are some of the basic commitments or reframes that or shifts that it provides?
Well, this is kind of my interpretation, and there'll be, it's a complex field from which people would answer that question very differently. But the way I like to think of it is actually relates to the previous session in terms of the neuroscience of the left and right brain hemispheres. So Ian McGilchrist has this amazing book called The Master and His Emissary. And way that brings to life, and his latest book was going to be There Are No Things, and then it got retitled. So he's very much a sort of process thinker. And there's this relationship between the left side of the brain, which narrows and tends to look at the focus, and then the right side of the brain, which looks at the whole and the context. And we need both sides of our brain to do anything in this world. So we need those things that are kind of abstracted from context, and we need the context. And so it's the relationship between those that I think process philosophy gives some clarity on, which is that we need to nest the abstractions in context as an ongoing process. So the commitment is to context. The commitment is to process and change. The commitment is to relationships. And out of that comes this commitment to the generativity, the creative process. And then as you apply that in different areas, you get a story of the world as this sort of person that's participating in the co-creative universe as a participant. And I think that then has these implications for how we think about our lives, how we think about the purposes that guide us, the purposes that guide organisations, the purposes that guide economies and governments. So I think that sort of brings up values. I could go on, but I'll try and keep my answer shorter.
Maybe just to add one more dimension, I think you already had a couple of really, really good ones, is this commitment to time and temporality, which is really foregrounded in process theory, process philosophy. At least much more than what we would usually do around those kinds of concepts in more traditional sort of philosophies. And I think it is also something that's much more, or very different to how we usually think about time and temporality. It's not this sort of linear clock time, but it's a much more sort of situated, again, in relationships, sort of constructed time, which gives a lot, at least in my research, gives me a lot to work with and work through, just to add one more dimension to this.
Very, very true. And it's interesting because it's not an asymmetrical notion of time. There's this idea of, in each new moment, everything, including like the atoms that make us and make up everything, is taking everything from the past and adding something new. So you have this kind of dynamic that's like this, it's really quite, and this is the metaphysics that gets, but Whitehead, and that's kind of there's various traditions of process philosophy, but Whitehead was a mathematician who turned it to philosophy in the early 20th century. And he did so because he saw relativity theory and then quantum physics as really changing our fundamental understanding of the world. And he wanted to interpret that and interpret what that means for science, what that means for society. And I forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, background.
I think, Scott, when you said before there are no things, that was a really big idea for me, is to recognise that this lounge, for instance, is a stable configuration. But if you were to think about it, if in 1,000 years, would it be here in this form? No, probably not. It'd probably disintegrate, right? And so when you see things as these concrete, fixed, with a clear concept that's got nice boundary of what it is and what it is not, or necessary and sufficient conditions of what makes a lounge a lounge, you recognise, well, it depends what sort of temporal scale are you looking at. Because if you zoom out or zoom in enough, you see that quite literally everything is in movement, is in process and interacting, which once again, I suppose just linking that back up to like, okay, big ideas, what's that mean, at least for me in practice, is once again a recognition that things we see as fixed can shift and will shift. And so that's a big part of our practice, is actually sensing when the dynamics can change. And so I do a lot of work with organisations, and what's really interesting is their sense of identity and what that enables or limits as to their space of possibility. So taking this, metaphysical idea, right, it has a highly practical considerations for what we understand of identity, for knowledge there. And so a big part of my work is when an organisation says, I mentioned earlier working with a community services provider that wanted to help communities better help develop their community. And they said, but we're a service provider. And it's really interesting because there's obviously a big gap between help communities and through a service. It's like, well, there's such a range of other things, but that identity and is obviously in that instance quite limiting. And by actually not recognising that our identity is actually produced through interaction and it is constantly being reconfigured, is one of the bigger insights from process philosophy. And I just thought that's an important point to land, is that, you get some pretty dense ideas and you read philosophy that can be very difficult to wrap your head around. But every now and then, once you get that sense of clarity of what this means, it can really catalyse a whole different way of thinking that's often not always super tangible in a sense. You read something, you're like, wow, that's significant. But it can be hard to point to something or to necessarily materialise it. But over time, I suppose it builds a different type of capacity, I suppose. Once again, for all this great, important stuff that we're talking about, assumptions, being open to different ways of thinking.
Can I pick up on a way in which I see that very practically embodied? Now that, that's a very, very useful metaphor to use. If I think about what often drives organisations and institutions, it's an untested assumption that they must exist in perpetuity. And so if I think about, for example, one of the things that I think makes DARPA such an interesting organisational configuration is exactly the idea that there is no durability to the essential structure of it. So you are drawing researchers from across an innovation system, you'll bring them together, they are solving a problem, they know there is precarity baked in here, you solve the problem, your job doesn't exist anymore, and you dissolve back out into this system. And so it, I think, has a capacity for risk-taking, a capacity to kind of engaging these questions of why and how does it need to continue to exist, that might be far more constructive as we move further into the 21st century than an assumption that the institutions that we've built in the 19th and 20th are still serve us. Because I think increasingly what we end up with is a set of progressive movements that actually look increasingly conservative. They are trying to kind of find a way, rhetorically and otherwise, to sustain status quos that aren't working for people.
I'm so glad to hear you say the thing about organizations have this assumption that they are permanent and that their existence implies the necessity of their existence, because that's the thing that drives me absolutely nuts. Organizations and people in them are so afraid to consider, what if this organization didn't exist or didn't need to exist? And so it leads to things like, we're a service provider. There will always be a need for our service. So rather than solving the underlying problem, you can perpetuate the problem to justify your existence. So I think that there's an interesting thing there about like the boundaries that we create to maintain that. So we create these sort of like inside the organization, outside the organization, who gets included or excluded from setting purpose, setting strategy, making decisions. People that are outside the organization are dependent on us, they need us, they have no right to be in the room, often. Not always, and that's changing a bit, but that's a really common thing that you see. And then, yeah, that sense of permanence, that perpetuation. Yeah. Because we were having a really good conversation before we started, and there's something that I feel like there's a really interesting and weird tension between the DARPA, like flexibility, solve the problem, dissolve out, and the era of the permanent restructure that we were talking about earlier, where management consultants come in or a new executive comes in and says, well, the problem here is your business isn't organized the right way. So we'll reorganize your business. And then the consultant leaves, the business is still suffering, and the new consultant comes in and says, the problem here is your business isn't organized the right way. And I think you and I both have lived through 10, 15 years of ongoing constant restructure in our workplaces. Yeah. So I'd love to hear more about like how you see the relationship or difference between those things, if you could. So I'm stealing your question role, Stephen.
So, I mean, welcome to the research sector. I feel, I think part of it might be a little bit of a jumping towards diagnosing the problem. And I like to slightly redirect this. One of the major assumptions that we are surfacing right now in the work that we're doing with our research teams is we've driven our research teams to be really, really cognizant and engaged with their stakeholders. And so, but part of the problem is the critical assumption is that the stakeholders know what they actually want or need and are telling you the truth about all of that. And this gets back to assumption and narratives again. And so I do think there's this rush to diagnose the problem as being, and again, to a theme that's dear to my heart, this idea of there's a technocratic solution to all of these problems. So the problem here isn't one that is more of a philosophical thing about whether the organisation should continue to exist, if that's what the system needs from it. It's not one about how are we engendering new conditions and capabilities and capacities within our people to behave in different ways and to self-organise. It's one of we don't have the boxes in the right order or the tree map done in exactly the way it needs to be, and if we could just like get to that nirvana, it would solve everything. I think there's quite a bit of that. There's this, it's an interesting tension between like a technocratic approach to thing and also a bunch of magical thinking that's going into that, right? Yeah.
Curious, as Julian, would you say, do you call yourself an anthropologist, or what's your discipline?
No, I would still say that I would say an organization theorist. So I theorize about how organizations operate, but I draw a lot on anthropological research. Like most of my research is taking ideas from Tim Ingold, for example, one of the leading anthropologists. Yes, so trying to bring some of those ideas into sort of the management and organization studies.
And I ask because, firstly, there's the interesting tension between philosophy as ideas versus lived practice. And there's variations on this notion of practice without philosophy is blind and philosophy without practice is paralyzed. So again, this type of connection of what's predominantly a industry-based audience talking about philosophy, I think, is already an interesting thing to be exploring. But both Scott is an anthropologist, and so you're obviously both methods of ethnography, and that's very dear to my heart as well, doing sort of design and strategy research as well. and you mentioned Tim Gold as a theorist that does this work. So where I'm getting to is this connection between observing the real world and that relationship between these big ideas that help us reframe or interrogate assumptions. Yeah, what's going on there in terms of your practice? When you do ethnography, for instance, is there a blank slate and then you're coming up with ideas? Or do you draw on particular frameworks and you're using that to actually understand what's going on in the world?
I would say the ideal is to have that blank slate and to actually go out into the field and do sort of very from the ground up sort of try to understand what's going on. I don't think this is always possible because we always come with our sort of own assumptions, and I mean, we talk about process philosophy here, so I bring those ideas into the field already. So I think it's you mentioned observing and observation in the field. I think it's not so much an observation of, and this is actually one of Ingold's ideas, it's not so much an observation of the field and what's going on here. It's more of an observation with the field, and you're actually working together with, in my case, digital nomads. I mean, I was sitting in the co-working space alongside with them. I was going on travels with them. It's this becoming part of the phenomenon and not being just an outside observer, but actually a participant within the phenomenon is I think, at least a way or a method, a way of doing research that is more sort of closely aligned with process philosophy.
Just, I was going to riff off that a little bit as a metaphor that Whitehead uses of the plane kind of starting on the ground of lived experience, lifting up into the air and flying through abstractions and then landing the plane back in lived experience. And I come back to that even when I was hearing you guys talk about the organisations, because it's sort of, there's this constant change, but how do we enable, like, I guess, relationships that are long-term to be developed and those sort of, that lived experience to foreground the then, because essentially an organisation is kind of an abstraction from the reality. We define it, and then, like, how do we kind of keep the things that we do in the world and we set up and the structures, how do we keep making sure they're working for us? Because I think so much of the problems of the world can be understood as we've created these abstractions and now everything we do works for these abstractions.
Yeah, it's Whitehead talks about misplaced concreteness. Yes. Yeah, where we take these concepts to be the reality, whereas they're really a way to give structure to emergent, ongoing patterns that are happening in the world. Yeah. Scott, what's your thoughts? Because you're in a really interesting place where you do futures thinking, which perhaps we can get into it as well, what this thing is. But you also are very literally on the ground. And, you know, right now we've got an excellent course at UTS, Envisioning Futures, where you are really balancing those things of being on the ground, lived experience, observing stuff, being thinking with a context, if you will, but at the same time trying to use that for, as you said, really provocative alternative ways of being.
Yeah. Maybe I can draw in another old white philosopher, Gregory Bateson. So one of my favorite people. I've never met him, but anyways. One of the bits that I love about his work is, I forget which chapter it's in, but anyways, in the book Mind and Nature, he talks about what's the difference between science and everything else. Because everything is based on presuppositions and assumptions and ways of seeing the world. And the difference is that science critically reflects on that, and it tries to say, well, what are the presuppositions? Do those presuppositions match up with the actual experience? And so I think that's one of the things that we do in ethnographic work, where we're trying to say, you know, the difference between maybe you and the digital nomads that you're with is that you're then going to actually take the time to reflect on what's going on here, whereas they're mostly going to just get on with doing whatever's going on there. And so, yeah, it's the futures subject example is an interesting one because at one time we're trying to invite students to spend time in the city of Sydney LGA, and we have a really grounded process of actually going out and doing observations. And partly we do that because the first year we ran the subject, we realized that none of them had any experience other than Central Station and UTS campus. So we're like, right, if we're going to think about the futures of the city of Sydney, we need to know what's there now. But then, so we get that concrete stuff, but then we also invite them to think about the future doesn't exist yet. We have images of the future that people try and tell us are what's going to happen, but we need to question those. And then we need to explore all sorts of alternatives and possibilities. So then we create this imaginary material that we ask students and other people, so City of Sydney, for example, are lovely partners in that subject, to actually engage with and say, oh, well, what if the world was that way? Do we like that? Is that a future worth wanting? Is that something that we want to strive for, or do we need to watch out for that? And then you can start to compare with, well, what's going on now, and which of these is contributing to a more just and equitable world. So yeah, I get really caught up and really deep and lost in the material and the real and the imaginary and how do we play them together. And yeah, it's fun, but I could ramble on for hours, so I'll stop.
Yeah, one of my favourite philosophical texts, it's by a Dutch philosopher, I think her name's Anne-Marie Mol, and it's called The Body Multiple. Are you familiar with it?
You introduced me to that.
Oh, cool.
Her to
yeah.
me. That book to me. Anyway.
I'm also curious to see if Melanie has engaged in this as well. And she goes into a hospital and takes very much an ethnographic approach to philosophy. So instead of starting top down, so to speak, with big concepts and applying those to the world, goes in to understand what is the practice of arteriosclerosis. And within a hospital, there are multiple different disciplines that are all practicing, they're all doing arteriosclerosis. So for instance, you have the pathologist that may be looking at one particular object, you've got the clinician that's looking at another, and on it goes. And what's really interesting, she looks at the fact that they sometimes are looking at different objects. Sometimes they're looking inside the artery. Sometimes they are looking at a scan of something. Sometimes they are looking at population data. And she looks at basically how this is actually enacting a reality. So she has this concept, ontological multiplicity. So again, the idea, and it builds off a similar concept called world making, but basically the idea that we have one environment, but there are many different realities that are being produced through our actions. And she looks at how these different disciplines, how they hang together. So sometimes they cohere, sometimes they complement, sometimes they conflict, and sometimes they don't really meet. And for me, that was just such a powerful piece of work because we all know the experience working in a team and it feels like we're saying the same thing, but we actually have totally different interpretations, totally different sets of value, totally different attunements to what we're focused in on. And yeah, it's just a really good example of philosophy that is really grounded, but also has very practical implications. Once again, coming back to a little bit more openness to recognise that even if we use the same concepts, even if we're in the same organisation, we really can be producing and, organising ourselves in totally different ways. So, yeah, once again, just another example of how philosophy can be highly theoretical, but also really practical and shift in how you approach your own world as well. Julian, I'm curious, I'd love for you to unpack a little bit for us your work and your research, because the intersection of technology, of how we work, how do you even research that? And, what are some of the insights that you've actually found?
Maybe a bit from sort of my most recent work, which isn't actually too empirical. It's more conceptual work, where I'm looking at how AI is now introduced in organizations and into work practices, really. And that's where I'm now trying to bring also a process philosophy lens into sort of the human AI collaboration literature. Again, actually drawing on one of Tim Ingold's concepts. He has done some research in sort of the area of carpentry and how carpenters work with timber. And he has this concept of the grain of the wood, and how it's sort of this historically sedimented sort of material, and how now carpenters work with the material, with or against the grain. And I try to bring that into the study of human AI collaboration, and how there is this kind of grain also there when we work with AI, when we use chatbots, when we sort of interact and interface with those systems. And what we're trying to show is, and again, bringing in this idea of time and temporality, and really the history of those systems, because it's again, that's where coming from more the empirical, or from the phenomenon, looking at how humans and AI work together, and how those systems have been developed, how those systems have been trained on essentially decades of data that has been on the internet. There is this history embedded into those systems, and now it is basically for us to figure out how to actually work with or against those systems. So that's one of the examples of sort of my most recent work. Not empirical. There's not really any data behind that, but sort of purely bringing in a process philosophical lens into the study of human and AI collaboration.
Maybe shifting gears a little bit, and perhaps shifting a little bit away from philosophy proper, so to speak, and critical inquiry in some respects is highly political. And maybe, Amelia, I'm curious for you, especially when you're at this systems level of innovation and change, how do you find how challenging or how open your context is to meaningfully critique, if you will? You mentioned earlier the big paradigm, and Scott, I know the work we've done in thinking about futures thinking, or you think about, you keep asking whys and what's the problem, and we often get back to capitalism, seems to be underlying a lot of things going on. Yet, do you find in your context you do have capacity and space to meaningfully critique some of these big paradigms or issues?
I mean, practically speaking, there's a tension at the heart of CSIRO, which is that it was interesting, the conversation this morning about purpose. Very few organisations have their purpose literally written into legislation in the way that CSIRO does. And part of that actually constrains engagement. So there are, for example, very strict rules around public comment on policy. There is a clear delineation between the kinds of ways in which, the kinds of inquiry that we engage in. But to answer that in a more general sense, I think that there is something, I always keep coming back to system maturity as being critical in understanding whether or not there is capacity or appetite for a lot of those conversations. And so I think about things like the way in which some European innovation systems are oriented and have kind of built up in such a way that there's really robust intermediary functions that are sitting outside of central government that are able to intermediate between conversations that are happening in context in communities, actions that are happening in context in communities, and these kind of more abstracted political concepts and political narratives. I find that in our system there are a few of those, and hopefully House of Complexity can be one of them, that's able to do that work of critiquing. And I think that a lot of this gets back to, something I'm really interested in, which is what is the political economy of innovation in Australia as opposed to elsewhere. I think we import a lot of our understanding of and narratives and assumptions about innovation from elsewhere, and there are some really unique things. And obviously, from my perspective, I look at that through the lens of how is our politics, how is our regulatory environment really, really different, and how does that come to constrain and shape and in some cases accelerate certain kinds of innovation. So I wouldn't say that there's, I think this is part of this effort in trying to cross-pollinate a bunch of conversations to allow that to happen. But my experience of moving through the system so far, and I want to remain humble about the limitations of that, but my experience has been there aren't that many opportunities for exactly this sort of conversation, and that people may be constrained by their institutional affiliations or by the resourcing that gets put behind some of this inquiry.
Scott, I'd love for you to pick that up, especially the practice of assumptions and unpacking them. What sort of practical methods and I know you've got, and maybe you'd like to share a little bit about your background, you've got both government, public sector experience, I should say, as well as working with, say, younger students that are coming up. What do you see as some of the themes or distinctions when it comes to the practice of examining assumptions?
So, I was listening to your response, Amelia, and being like, oh man, yeah, how can I pick up from there? Because there's so much in it. It takes me back to something you mentioned right earlier, Stephen, where you said you might not be the most popular person if you start bringing philosophy into the workplace. And it connected for me with something that you said earlier about you're given the brief, and the brief is built on all these assumptions. You're definitely not the most popular person if you ask why this brief. And I've seen that in private sector work. I've seen it in public sector work. There can be a real hierarchy. I'm trying to piece together something deep and meaningful here that's not really working. But yeah, really just recognizing the political construction and maintenance of what knowledge is and what the scope for questions is, and the things we all believe in this space, even though we don't say them out loud, I think is a really interesting place to be attentive to, but also a really hard place to work. Like in the day-to-day, it can be a grind. It can be exhausting and demoralizing and break you and send you running back to the academic sector where it turns out it's not necessarily better. So yeah, it's the politics of knowledge, I think, are something really deeply real. And I don't know how to navigate that very well. I don't have answers. So I think there's a really good question there. And
Can I pick up on that?
Please do.
Okay, so I was interviewing some colleagues from the missions program the other day, people who led individual missions, and I was saying, a year after the conclusion of this program, what are your big reflections about this and about your experience? And one of the ones that was really interesting was this idea, and there's a little bit of literature from Fraunhofer exploring this now, but this idea of centrality versus peripherality of organisations in a system, and their latitude to move versus their authority. And in talking to this colleague, he just perfectly embodied this idea, because he said that as a political neophyte, he'd never had the experience of trying to negotiate the science policy interface before. And then he went into departments and he was engaging across departments, and he didn't understand all of the unwritten rules about how all of that works. But his reflection was that was so freeing for everybody involved, because there was no expectation that he would know what those rules and channels were. There was a lot more forgiveness of when he transgressed them, and it allowed him to really build trust across barriers that may have been established. And going back to assumptions and narratives, like the thing about a Westminster tradition that says that individual departments ought to be in some kind of Socratic competition with one another for their ministers and their prime minister's attention. And so it makes collaboration really and cooperation really difficult, and finding these opportunities. And so I think there is this real power in sitting at the periphery of systems and being able to move between them to really open up new lines of for change.
Yeah. And I'm curious if this has been your experience, Julian, too, with doing ethnographic work, but part of our disciplinary tradition in anthropology is you go to another place. So you're an outsider that goes, and you get to ask all these stupid questions because you haven't been raised in this context. You don't know what the rules are. And so there's a really useful power in that, to be the naive person. When I started working in New South Wales government, one of the first things that happened was I asked some of the directors, when you keep saying policy, what is it? And they couldn't answer. And I was like, oh, because I actually don't know, and I probably still don't know. But there's a lot of assumptions, and people just use words, and it takes an ignorant fool outsider who has this kind of marginal position or peripheral position to come in and sometimes be the one that gets to say these silly things that then opens up conversation. So that can be a really powerful tool, I think. Yeah. But one last thing on that. And then the risk is that the institutional immune system kicks in and recognizes you as a foreign microbe. And it's like, right, yeah, no, you're not doing that here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is my life as a consultant. It's really interesting. We're at this period of time as well that, that dirty word consultancy and some of the bigger ones, what they've been up to. But it's interesting because that point, it is so valuable to have someone, the fresh eyes, to come in. A big part of my work is, I mentioned earlier, I've got some people that may be 20 years deep in a particular industry, certain set of language and tools and ways of thinking and just patterns. And it is so hard for them to even see beyond that. So creating the context for them to rationally learn elsewhere. And I say rationally because the logical places to learn are still not that interesting. They still kind of riffing off the same assumptions and foundations. They typically are exploring within their sector and maybe a couple other places. One of the practices that I really love, it's this idea of exaptive. So in evolutionary theory, something that has developed elsewhere can be applied to a different context. So we've talked a lot today about frame innovation or reframing, and the rationality that gives you to go and do some seemingly weird things is because you get down to a values level. Aged care provider may be looking to create a community, for instance. So we get to ask the question of, well, where else creates community? And that gives us permission to go and talk to, I don't know, a football coach to understand how they create bonding. And we learn things about the principle of banter, for instance, or camaraderie, or how you need to struggle together. And that gives you a whole different way of thinking and a completely powerful set of insights to really challenge the foundational assumptions that without that unconventional connection, you just never would have got close to. Maybe one thing that you mentioned earlier and that Julian also mentioned around how you do research is our relationship with knowledge and what is legitimate and valued and what we pay attention to. Probably the first thing, and it's good to share, within a university context, you're forced to really explicitly outline what are your assumptions in your actual methodology. So it might just be for those that aren't as acquainted with that as a process, what is that as a ritual or a practice? And I guess how effective is that? And is that something that you think could be more useful in other contexts?
Looking at me. I feel like that practice is really different in different fields. I don't know. I've had this quote in my head I wanted to share when you were talking about knowledge, which is that when you strip knowledge of values, you're left at the moment with one value, which is money. So we've come to this place where money has been the value that is really shaping knowledge in probably ways that I don't know, that is certainly being explored and critiqued by lots of people, but in the mainstream, how is that shifting things? So if you think of medicine, if you think of what projects are awarded funding for, how is the influence of, how is this influence unfolding? And saying commercialisation of within universities, we're encouraged to build relationships with industry, but how do you navigate these complex relationships and interests? Certainly in social sciences, we're very explicit about our values. In peace and conflict studies, you couldn't be more explicit about your values for peace, not for violence, for justice. And I think sometimes, I think sometimes in universities we're not actually, as a whole, like the orientation of a university isn't really explicit about values because they're oriented to knowledge. So how do we orientate universities to values such as peace, justice, and sustainability? Others.
In business schools, it's very similar. We also are always asked to present our assumptions very clearly. I have to say, though, I think it's not so much, the reason is not that we want to be clear about that we are for peace or against violence. I think in business school, the problem is more about sort of being able to compare, being able to evaluate someone else's work. In order to do that, we need to be very clear about what sort of our underlying assumptions are, what sort of methods we are using in what way, and in order to do that carefully, I think it's important to be very clear about how you have done the research. In that sense, we are similar, but coming from a different direction, I guess.
Like quite literally, how do you do that? Is it a submission and there's some boxes you have to fill in? How do you even acknowledge or identify yourself what the assumptions are?
Oftentimes it's enough to just put a reference into your work. Like as soon as you mention a particular author, a particular stream of literature, everyone in that field already knows what sort of your underlying assumptions are. It's actually quite simple and straightforward, but yeah, nonetheless, it needs to be done.
And you mentioned a particular way of researching, which I thought was interesting. You said so when you're exploring or studying digital nomads that sometimes you're actually working alongside them. So what's the assumption there in terms of the legitimacy of that data or knowledge you're collecting? And how do you see that against some of the other dominant paradigms of what, particularly from a scientific perspective, what's counted as real knowledge?
Yeah, very, very interesting question. I think if one would come to this sort of research from one of those more mainstream, more traditional sort of research perspectives, I think it would be quite problematic. I think there would be this notion that I am sort of spoiling the data. I'm not this neutral outsider looking into the phenomenon, but I'm actually part of it. And what or how they respond to me is actually changing their behavior already as I'm part of the phenomenon. But I think that's what again process philosophy offers, that when one takes such a perspective, we are honest about that, we acknowledge that, and as part of that sort of metaphysical framework, that's perfectly fine. And I think that's what helped me a lot in that sense to make that legitimate, that sort of research.
What's coming to mind for me is the kind of the evolution of methods training in anthropology, and what I'm seeing now at the university, which isn't necessarily anthropology, but so when I was just a wee anthropologist, the story was, so we had a methods class as an undergrad, which was lovely. We actually had somebody teaching us like how do you use different methods of data collection and analysis. It's pretty basic at the time. It was the 90s. But the introduction to that class from the professor who had studied in the UK was, well, back in the day when I did my PhD, they would hand you somebody's ethnography and just say, go forth and do likewise. That was their methods training. So in the discipline, it was like, well, you go away, you spend time with people, you make a bunch of notes, and then you come back and make sense of it later. And you might be grounded in already a whole bunch of theories, like why did you choose to go to that place that you're studying? And then there's been a lot of evolution. So I'm seeing more and more sort of rigorous training in methods. And one of the tools that I really love comes from, I think it's Mark Saunders. He's a management scholar. And there's one of the countless research methods handbooks. I think it's Research Methods for Business Students or something like that. And they've got this lovely model called the research onion, which shows you all these layers that go from your sort of ontological and epistemological and axiological assumptions. We haven't talked about axiology yet, but purpose and value, right? All the way down to like, well, what kind of data is it legitimate to even conceptualize and create in alignment with that philosophical paradigm? And so you can think of the research onion as this like set of dials that you're twisting to get alignment, and different arrangements of those dials can either lead you to nonsense, or they can lead you to multiple different ways to ask the same kind of question. I don't know that in industry you need to go through a really extreme rigorous process like that, but certainly a lot better than we've got a question, let's do a survey, which is often the default, right? Like, we're going to do a survey. Okay, well, what are you even going to ask people about? Who are you going to sample? What makes these questions valid? How do you know anything? And then thinking about, well, what information, what evidence is actually needed in the decision context, right? What will people respond to? And how do they make sense of it? And often, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm speaking too bluntly, but often there's a bit of theater in that, right? You go out and do research because somebody needs to be able to point to a report to justify the decision they already made. Or ideally, the decision will be data-driven, which means we don't have to exercise any judgment because the data has told us what to do. Fairly scary world to live in, especially if, the data is not objective. It's not the real thing. It's a map of the territory, and maybe you've got the wrong map.
Yeah, it comes back to the, one of the big insights that nothing really is neutral in a sense, and that's why interpretation and meaning matters so much. What's funny, you mentioned there the word theatre, and it definitely made me think about there's so many, especially in the design thinking context, there's so many great methods that are supposed to help us reveal assumptions. For instance, you asked the 5 whys. There's various things that help you work out what your worldview is, for instance. And I'm curious for each of you. I guess one thing that comes up for me is I don't know if that necessarily really reveals an assumption. And I'm just curious if you could think, this might be a hard question, but has there been a personal experience in your own practice, or what has been the conditions that's led to you really challenging a particular assumption? Is it, for instance, by doing your research process and you have to state clearly, or is it actually something that's almost hard to pinpoint and it's just over time you start to see things a bit differently?
Mine was quite profound. My first thesis for my master's was called An Ethical Dilemma, Childhood Conversion into Christian Fundamentalism, which as soon as I wanted to sort of explore worldviews and Christianity, which I'd been brought up in, people were not so keen to be my supervisor, but I found someone. And I guess, and what was quite profound was realizing that my version of Christianity, which sort of treated the Bible as the literal word of God, couldn't be questioned, was one version of Christianity, which wasn't all of them. And so that was a real kind of awakening moment, which I think of in terms of Paulo Frere's idea of conscientization, which is this process of coming to see yourself in context and taking steps against sort of oppressive elements of that. And I had the same kind of thing happen when it came to questioning capitalism, to go, oh, this isn't we're not living like most people in the world. Actually, we're living very, we're in the 1% probably, in the top, certainly 5% in the world. This is not, and you come to then that questioning, oh, wow, actually, we're not living in a way that can be sustainable. And so that was some of mine.
For me, I would say it's really this lived experience that we have been talking about. I think this going out into the field, actually experience how others are doing things, how others are working in my case, how others are organizing themselves. I think that's where my assumptions get challenged the most. Just realizing that you don't have to sit in an office 9 to 5 all day. You can go out and work from a co-working space. You can go out work from overseas. All those kinds of things, just that sort of lived experience is, I think, very powerful to me, at least.
One of the things that I've been trying to question a lot recently is the real value of some of these design methodologies in surfacing assumptions, and not that there's not value in them, but I think sometimes the way they get deployed is an attempt to short circuit a much more fundamental and substantive engagement that needs to take place. And I think about, just like the industrial scale at which we're trying to do some of this work, and a set of assumptions that, as I said this morning, if we could just get a more specific, if we can just define the problem with specificity, then magically everybody will orient towards trying to solve it. For example, that putting people through a process to do things like surface context logs or surface assumptions, when they're not in a mindset to prepare themselves for that. One of the things for me personally that's been really challenging is I went through, I bloody hate leadership courses. Like, I just get in them and I'm just like a cranky toddler who's like, I know that I'm going to hate this and it's going to do things, to my psyche that I don't appreciate. And I remember I went through one a couple of years ago with a bunch of research leaders, and I didn't realize how much I was carrying around this set of, my mental model was so shaped by my understanding of political science and positional authority and the way things are structured, that I had a research colleague after 6 months. We had an exercise where we had to say, what do you wish that I was more curious about? And she said really gently, she's like, I just really, really wish that you were more curious about what my perspective was. And that was really interesting because I had been moving through this organisation and this experience with the perspective of, I am the materially disempowered one, I'm kind of outnumbered by all of these researchers, they have all the power. And that was completely in complete opposition to how she was experiencing things. And so I sat with that for a really long time. I was like, no thank you, for a while. And then I thought a lot about it, and I was like, part of, I think, this exercise in trying to build your own leadership capability, trying to build these new kinds of capacities in organisations, is working out how to sit in the really uncomfortable tension between the space between different people's perspectives. That's my answer.
This is maybe, I forget what the original question was, but this has been so cool. The thing that's coming to mind there is, and it comes from my Buddhist practice, so I practice in a Zen Buddhist tradition, and one of the really important practices and teachings that I've been working with for quite a while now is just to ask myself in any situation, are you sure? And it's not an invitation to justify and double down on these are all the reasons I'm sure, so everybody else shut up. It's what are the ways that I might be perceiving things well and I might be perceiving things poorly, and what are the underlying assumptions that are leading me to that? And the complementary piece to are you sure is you're partly right. And there's a recognition there that I'm probably partly right about most things, but only partly right. And so is everyone else. And so hearing you guys talk about the other people's perspectives, different ways of interpreting a whole religion, right? It's a bit of sort of openness and humility that allows you then to maybe start to recognize your assumptions, hold them a little less tightly, and in some way maybe model that and invite other people to also do that. And I worry, though, that there's a destabilizing aspect of that, because I think often for organizations or communities, you need to have an assumption about truth and purpose that's shared enough that we can all come into work and do the thing that we're paid to do, usually paid to do, not there because we love it or because it's the right thing to do. And so I do wonder what happens when you destabilize that. How does an organization or a community or a society persist when we start to recognize the plurality of assumptions and worldviews and worlds, not just worldviews, that we live in?
But what other choice is there at this point in time?
Well, the current system isn't working, clearly. So.
And the acceleration of, I've been thinking a little bit about this, the interface between AI and team dynamics, and this generational conversation that we were having before this session, and the real possibility that it accelerates the atomization of all of our conversations, that we go to. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but I was using one of my AI tools the other day and explaining some small p political context to it, and it came back and said, that must be really difficult for you to deal with. That must be really challenging. And I thought, hang on a second. I didn't, but the impulse to be like, yeah, it really is. Can you further reinforce this very narrow perspective that I'm giving you on this very complex problem? And if all of us disappear down these rabbit holes and can't find a way to find common ground, then what will society even mean or look like?
Yeah. Well, that atomization, right? We were having a conversation on Tuesday because one of Barbara's amazing PhD students is doing research on this. And we're having this conversation about, okay, so if people are using their generic AI tools, not even the companion AIs, but generic ones as their consultant, their advisor, their counselor, their priest, whatever, it's like a really intense version of the filter bubble, really isolating. Yeah. But also, that sort of implies that we're not doing that with other humans.
Yes.
Meanwhile, we need other humans to literally survive. Like, if we're going to reproduce, we're going to need to engage. And I think she had this lovely metaphor of frictionless conversation with AI, and the fact that humans are messy and there's friction. And if we don't learn how to actually work with that friction and be in it and be uncomfortable but manage it, then the whole thing unravels. We don't want friction's no good.
We want convenience.
Uncomfortable.
Frictionlessness and convenience. Yeah. There's this, one of the things that I really am drawn to is the work of Gary Gersel, who's a political historian, and he has written a book about the rise and fall of the neoliberal order, in which he explains that the moral underpinnings of some of these orders, and he talks about the fact that what makes it so politically salient is that it has this vision for what a good life looks like, and that in the rupture and decay that has occurred in the last decade or so, what seems to be emerging out of this is, well, what does a good life look like? It looks like one where you don't have to talk to anyone or have any real conflict. You be frictionless, and it's utterly convenient. And then, so this to me feels like the intersection between human dynamics and innovation in a way that we are not really having a sort of public discourse about.
That's the friction. Yeah, I don't know. This makes me think of the whole thing that makes evolution and change possible is the uncertainty, the ambiguity, and the friction, right? If everything's frictionless, nothing changes because nothing has to change, and then we're dead. There's no adapting to changing context because there's no friction with it that tells us we need to adapt. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Oh. Thanks, Amelia.
It's like ultra-processed food for our brains. Yeah. So I'm studying food at the moment in my postdoctoral work with Charles Perkins Centre, and they use a complex systems approach too. But ultra-processed food as this sort of convenience, frictionless, and it's just there's nothing, and kids eat it from the start with no textures and difference, no relationships to where it's come from, no nothing. It's just this packet, and that's what's desirable because that's what's got credence in the playground, and that's engineered to be so tasty and with the worst possible ingredients because they're the cheapest, and it's like, it's sucking the life out of life.
Yeah.
That's an example.
Yeah.
Scott, you mentioned the destabilizing effect of all of this. I've definitely seen that when I actually did my master's at the transdisciplinary school. We started that during COVID period, and it's a lot of people from all walks of organisational life. And they come in typically because they're people that are a bit frustrated, they're really seeking change. I'm talking people that are in the Defence Force, for instance. So you talk about some of the ethical issues that you might reveal to yourself if you really think about things there. And about halfway through doing this course, and per why we're here as somewhat of a design organisation talking about philosophy, I realised, and I said to Case, I said, oh, we're basically just doing philosophy here, aren't we? And, you know, in some way, a big part of the theme of today, when talking about complexity, talking about the need to be so reflexive, is that we do need a more of a practical sense of, reflecting and inquiring. And I cannot tell you how many people, myself included at various points, had pretty much some mini existential crisis and a sense of loss of meaning once you actually do dig into certain aspects of these assumptions or these dynamics that you've been working in or operating in, and you realize, oh shit, this actually doesn't make any sense, or actually I'm contributing to something that's really not so great here. And just the other thing I wanted to ask each of you, because you obviously all have such deep domain expertise, and I'm curious to understand a little bit more about this food work. What would you say are some of the big assumptions that you're observing in your context right now that are sort of grating with you?
That's a good question. So I think there's various social forces that are kind of ruling or governing in a way how food is practiced, and the way of global industrial capitalist food systems that are the main system. But you also have on the other side diverse food systems, diverse relationships with food. You have people that are doing community gardens. You have people who are living in many different cultural contexts and different ways of doing food. So you kind of have these two systems side by side, and one at the moment is being reinforced by almost every aspect of our economy, the objective of GDP growth indiscriminately being, the way that governments are evaluated, the way that nations are evaluated. So you've got these systems that are feeding at the moment the rise and continuing dominance of an industrial food system, mass producer. You've got scale, you've got economics, you've got centralized power, more and more just fewer organizations that own the whole food supply and demand and control everything. So you have these sort of assumptions, and then you see that play out, say, in agriculture, where I was in Edinburgh at some workshops, and the assumptions of some of the food systems scientists there was that solutions to the problems of the world's food problems and producing enough food come from more scale, and it has to be commercialized. And so you just see the assumptions just unfold, and being even in our research centres where we are questioning. So the question I have is then, how do you nurture the alternative food systems and let them scale out? And so that involves interventions like, okay, how do we change GDP? Maybe make it more discriminate, and we're aiming for the aspects of GDP we want, and broaden out that conversation, and that various other ways. So I think that's some of the ways I can see it play out.
In my field, I think it's going back to the point that we talked earlier about sort of what are actually the things that we are talking about. And I think in management, but in sort of technology more specifically, this is still one of the main assumptions that, at least in my work, I'm trying to sort of disrupt a little bit, is this idea that an organization is a thing. Technology is a thing. It's this static, the AI system is this static thing with its boundaries and sort of never changing properties, even though, I mean, now with AI, this is sort of somewhat dissolving even among the, I would say, the most hardcore sort of essentialists, that because these things can now learn, and then now so there is some sort of change built into those systems. But nonetheless, it's still this idea is that we can adopt this technology, we can introduce it into our organization, And then once we have done that, then we're done. Then we're using it. So there's these steps. We're doing implementation, and then we're doing use. Whereas there's really no such thing as we have this stable AI technology and we implement this once and then we're done. It's this constant configuration of what the human is in relation to the AI, and sort of it is really a process rather than a thing. So it's getting back to that point that we were talking earlier about thinking deeply about what actually the things are, and are there really any things left, or at the very least, sort of what has priority? Is it the processes that have priority, and then not denying that there are things at some point, but is it the thing that has priority or the process?
Two things from my end. I mean, it's been 10 years since the first missions globally were instigated, and so it's like a really nice point in time to think back on what are the major contributions of this new movement in contemporary innovation. And I keep coming back to this idea that it was really taboo to talk about innovation as being political, as being essentially political, and that I think that is a really substantial contribution to the political kind of innovation, that we can now say innovation is political. There are a set of things that flow from that, from the ability to say that, including the role that the state can and has always. And I think like part of the narrative structure here of missions is to surface the fact that, you know, even during that sort of fallow period where there was this set of assumptions that the state's role was to sit back and let market forces do their thing, in fact, the history of innovation, like a close look at it, will show you that the state has been intervening all along. It may not have been doing so to shape the direction of innovation, but it shows that it is capable instrumentally of doing that work. And I think that's a really significant contribution. It also means that it brings it into a realm of public discourse that makes it legitimate for a whole range of people to have a view on it, and I think that's critically important. This isn't just the domain of like scientists, tech bros, entrepreneurs. It's for everybody to have a view. So that's one set of things. The other assumption is a little bit more depressing, which is, you know, this idea that, you know, the sort of unmistakable impression that you get from reading the Ambitious Australia report, which is the report that was issued at the back end of the strategic examination of the R&D system a couple of weeks ago, that the system is broken and that there are concrete things that we are going to need to do to fix it that are going to be really challenging to incumbent interests and institutions. And yet, so that sort of like that's almost, you know, unanimity around that concept, and yet the deep skepticism and cynicism on the part of all, you know, a substantial number of the people who would be involved in that change, that it's possible. So that to me feels like we're at a real inflection point in our system right now. If we can move past, I think part of this cynicism comes from a history of these kinds of catalytic reviews showing the same thing, and people have talked about, you know, going back into the 2000s, there have been reviews that have said we need to be more directional and inclusive in the way that we're funding R&D, for example. But so I think a bit of it comes from a bunch of people who've watched this particular movie before, and a bunch of it comes from a set of really good in isolation reasons why it can't work, and yet if it doesn't, what's the counterfactual here? So yeah, a good time to be testing assumptions.
I think this follows on from the conversation. I was going to say that the work that I'm doing that I'm most excited about is looking at the intersection between worldviews and material concrete systems, like lived reality. So I'm doing some work that connects with transforming our worldviews and asking, okay, so what happens when we actually are able, and we here, I mean probably most of us who are enculturated into the dominant paradigm of individuals and separation of human and nature and things and commercial entities and all this. What happens when we start to realize our inherent relationality the process nature of reality, right? So what happens when we start to acknowledge our ecological self that's so much larger than just the body and the being? And in some of those communities, which I'm a part of, one of the assumptions seems to be that once we have that awakening, that realization, the work is done. Now all of a sudden the world changes, transformation has happened, but it doesn't. So if I share an example, I'll go and spend a weekend retreat up in Bilpin at the monastery that's connected to the Buddhist tradition I practice in. And it's beautiful, and there I can realize and practice and live that sense of interbeing. And then I get in my car, and I start driving back down, and by the time I get to Richmond, I'm like, oh, yep, well, that's gone. And it happens, I used to volunteer once in a while at Pocket City Farms, and it's the same thing. I'd ride my bike over, go and do an hour of weeding and planting in this amazing little permaculture thing, and be like, oh, we're doing things differently. Then I get on my bike, and I head back through Forest Lodge and Glebe and back into the inner west, and I'm like, oh, shit, it's cars everywhere. Here we are separated again. So the assumption there is like, is that sort of worldview, seeing the world differently, transformation enough? And manifestly it's not. So then what do we need to do to actually make systems transformation happen? And I think it comes to the political, the institutional arrangements are a big part of it. Like, what are the set of governing rules and incentives and structures that we're kind of forced to live in that we have to change to actually enable a more process-oriented way of living that's probably much more in line with the complex and beautiful and horrifying and scary dynamics of a living planet. So just small questions, really.
Yeah. This whole conversation's just been small, simple, straightforward.
Yeah, super easy, lightweight.
Yeah, we're almost just about to close things down. The question, I'll give you a moment to have a think about. We've been talking about the value of philosophy a little bit. I'm curious, each of you, is there a particular area of philosophy or theory in general, or just an interesting concept that you might think is a little bit underrated, that for people that we might have created some interest in going a bit deeper or exploring literature, if you will? Anything that comes to mind. And just one thing while I'll give you guys a chance to think about, once again, a simple, straightforward question, is one of the biggest insights I had when it comes to a lot of what we're talking about here is just the difficulty and the ongoing challenge of revealing your assumptions. In some respect, my whole job is helping organisations to do that, and I absolutely recognise that I'm full of them that I just have no sense of. And one of the most difficult but helpful questions is actually answering that question, well, what are the limitations of my practice or what I'm seeing or doing? There's a really good book, which I can't remember the exact title, it's by a theologian, and Roger's a big fan of it, and it's all about the dominant paradigms of how we've made meaning. So it looks at mythology, philosophy, archetypal psychology, and sort of naturalism, and on it goes. And it just identifies the dominant ways we've made meaning and how that attunes us into certain aspects of the world, but also how by tuning into something we're not looking into other things. And therefore it has some strengths, but of course always it has limitations. And that's perhaps in a world where one of the biggest assumptions is more data, more inputs means more objective, better answer. And we're seeing that right now with AI. And I've got friends in tech that they're loving it. More agents that have more things that better answers. We're done, humans. As if there's no as if it's completely neutral and we'll get the objective answer there. So that's something I wanted to leave there. Is it's such a powerful but difficult and uncomfortable thing, is getting better at recognizing our own limitations and the practices that we're doing there. So in closing, is there anything that you guys want to leave with, whether it is a particularly useful philosopher, concept, or just a final thought?
So mine is about positive futures, or images of positive futures, which I'm so excited to hear about the unit you're teaching, and really participatory, exciting imagine the future that we want and how can we work towards that future, and then structures to help enable that to come about. And I feel like in a time where there's just so many problems, that can help lift us out. And there's a book, it's called, I think it's called Another World is Possible, and I think it's Mulgan, is it Jeff Mulgan? And he has this idea of thick imaginaries. So we can, of course, have sort of thin imaginaries, but if we can use a thick imagination to really work through what would the changes in structures be? What would the changes in cultures? How would we behave differently? What would life be like? How would that really unfold? And doing that in really participatory ways. We can't these things need to be really democratic, and I know the next session will cover some of those ideas as well. So, but yeah, that would be mine.
I'll keep it brief. One of the things that I'm working on at the moment, or the concepts that I'm wrestling with, is attention. And I think it brings us back to some of the points we discussed earlier around sort of the frictions and the convenience. And I think that's really the opposite here, to think about being attentive to what's going on in the world, not just sitting back and sort of enjoying. Sort of really being active, intentional about attending and responding to what's going on.
I sort of mentioned it earlier, but I do think this idea of political orders and digging into the way in which it's short-circuited a lot of our thinking. There's it's an incredibly stabilizing force from which, and it has like a logical flow that impinges on so many aspects of life. And I'll give you one example of that sits well outside these realms. Nothing has radicalized me like being a mother. Yeah. And understanding, like starting to kind of really think about the care infrastructure and the set of assumptions that exist around the care infrastructure, and the idea that it gets framed as a productivity question. These are things that to me, again, flow from a set of assumptions about what is valuable and purposeful, and what is virtuous, what is meaningful in life. And I think there is a through line back to this set of assumptions about growth. So I really recommend reading Gary Gersel's work. Yeah.
So two things that maybe aren't really related. I'm going to give myself some homework because I mentioned axiology earlier, and I think it's crucially important, this understanding what makes something valuable and how do we understand what good is and what makes something good or not good. But I actually don't have any recommendations for what to read in that space because I haven't actually read actual philosophers in that space. So homework for me, homework for everyone. We're all going to do that. Yeah. The other is, and this, I sometimes use the phrase not library book, airport book. And it's a bit dismissive. It's like, oh, that's an airport book. I don't know. But a really good one that I really love is by Dan Davies. It's called The Unaccountability Machine. And one of the things that I love about what he does in that is he really beautifully and clearly explains Stafford Beer and cybernetics. And where I'm going with that is that a really valuable thinking tool is the acronym POSIWID. The purpose of a system is what it does. So there's a way there to look at, well, what does our system actually do? What does our organization actually do? And be really brutal and frank about it, not like, oh, we think it does this, but those other guys make it so we can't do that. And like being really, really transparent and frank about what actual effects does our system have in the world. And then looking at that in comparison with maybe our value statement or our mission statement to say, what is the thing that we think we do? And once you recognize that there's often a pretty huge gulf between those two things, then you can start to work to actually reconcile them and say, well, how would we have to rearrange this whole system? And we often have to rearrange the whole system right down to the base assumptions, like the care infrastructure. Oh my God, yeah, it just kills me, right? It's like commercialize the shit out of it. That'll solve everybody's problems. And of course, I almost said venture capital wants to get into childcare because there's so much money in it, right? And governments love that because productivity boosts, and just drives me nuts. I'm getting agitated. But if we can use that posywid, right? Look at what our system actually does. Is that actually the thing we want our system to do? What are the potential harms we're creating here? And I think it goes back to that assumption of permanence and continuity and necessity that says, my organization must exist because it exists, so it must. And we must work to keep it existing and doing what it does. Well, if we're not even actually looking critically at what it does, then we can't actually say, is this a thing that we want it to do? And once we can do that, then we can get on to actually doing that deep transformational work.
It's an excellent place to leave it. Thank you so much. Very much appreciated. We'll just take a few moments break and be back building on this of how we resist the obvious. So thanks again.